This is the first of two videos on Chapter 28, the endocrine system. Here's an overview of the endocrine system. Basically, it consists of glands and tissues that secrete hormones. Hormones are chemicals that affect other glands or tissues that are located far away from the site of hormone production. In other words, the target tissue is going to be located in a different part of the body from the tissue that produces the hormone. And basically, like the nervous system, the endocrine system influences other organ systems in maintaining homeostasis. And you can think of the endocrine system as another means of communication. But instead of being nervous system communication, we're talking about communication with chemicals. And it has influences on cellular metabolism, growth, and development. Hormones can affect a lot of different things, mood, emotions, sexual attraction, developmental patterns, just very many processes. So you can see the caterpillar transitioning to a butterfly. You can see this tadpole, which is on its way to being a frog. And hormones actually do affect these types of developmental patterns to a great degree. So we're going to start to take a look at some different types of hormones. Among one of the main ones is growth factors, and these are hormones that will promote cell division and mitosis. Another type of hormone is something that is technically called a paracrine, but I'm not going to ask you to remember that. This is a local hormone. It doesn't make its way into the bloodstream like hormones from the endocrine system do, but it does affect cells locally and tissues locally. A good example of this is a type of chemical called a prostaglandin, and we will see this in a little bit more detail later on. So, as well as looking at different types of hormones, we're going to take a look at the different endocrine glands and also other tissues that have endocrine activity. So endocrine glands, the first thing to tell you about endocrine glands is that they have no ducts, and a duct is basically a tube that leads to a body surface. And so in this case, endocrine glands, because they secrete their product into the circulatory system, they have no need for a tube that carries their product to a surface, so they have no ducts. So they'll secrete hormones into tissue fluid, and this diffuses into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, do secrete their products through ducts. A good example of this would be sweat glands. So another good example is also salivary glands, which send saliva to the mouth through salivary ducts. And so the interior surface of your mouth is considered to be a body surface because it is open to the environment. So homeostasis is going to require cooperation between the endocrine and nervous systems. And let's take a look at a comparison of these two systems. First of all, the endocrine system is going to work by secreting hormones into the blood. The nervous system is going to transmit nerve impulses. And what's the result of these things? Well, first of all, the endocrine system has a slower response than the nervous system does. However, the endocrine system has a more prolonged response than does the nervous system. So basically, if you want a long-lasting response to a particular stimulus, you're going to use the endocrine system. But the trade-off there is that the response is slower. If you want a fast response to a particular stimulus, you're going to use the nervous system. But here, the trade-off is that the response doesn't last nearly as long. Okay, so generally the blood concentration of a substance can prompt an endocrine gland to secrete its hormones. So basically the parathyroid gland can secrete a hormone when blood calcium levels fall below normal. When this happens, osteoclasts will slowly release calcium from the bone. So this is the type of cell that responds to this hormone. It takes time for this response to work, but it is long-lasting. Here are the glands of the endocrine system, and we're going to start out by looking at the glands that are actually located in the brain. So first of all, there's the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, which regulates sleep-wake cycles. There's the hypothalamus, which produces the hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, and we'll see more information on that in just a minute. There's the pituitary gland, which is also called the hypophysis, and the pituitary gland often gets referred to as the master gland of the endocrine system, and we'll see why in a few slides. This is the thyroid gland. It has a lot of different functions throughout the body. On the back side of the thyroid gland, you're going to find the parathyroid glands. So there's 4 of them, 2 on either side. This is the thymus gland. It is involved in immune cell maturation, and this actually starts to degenerate right around the time of puberty. These are the adrenal glands. They're located on top of the kidneys, therefore their name adrenal. This is the pancreas. It produces insulin and glucagon, which regulate your blood glucose levels. And these are the gonads, testis in the male and ovaries in females. So, again, here are your principal endocrine glands and the hormones that they produce. And instead of reading through this table, what I'd like you to do is kind of pause the video right now and take a look at this information. Here's additional information on endocrine glands. And again, you can pause the video here. So, the production of most hormones is controlled by 2 things. One is going to be negative feedback, in which the hormone responds to the condition that it regulates, or the blood level of the hormone that it's producing. And we'll explain that in just a minute. Also, production of most hormones is controlled by action of other hormones, and in this case you see insulin and glucagon. Now, insulin and glucagon act in direct opposition to one another. What insulin will do is to reduce your blood glucose levels. What glucagon will do is to increase them. So if you take a look at this diagram, we're going to kind of follow along with what negative feedback is. So if you have too much or too little of a particular characteristic, let's say too much or too little blood glucose, then you're going to have a number of things that start happening. First of all, you'll have some sort of stimulus, and this stimulus would actually be the presence of too much or too little of a particular characteristic. This is going to lead to a change of internal conditions. So this change of internal conditions is going to be picked up by some sort of sensor, so some sort of receptor in the body. This sensor is going to send data. In other words, it's going to send information about what changes have been happening to a control center, which is usually located, or not usually, but it's usually located in the central nervous system. That control center is going to come up with a response to the stimulus, and it's going to instruct other tissues to have some sort of effect on the stimulus. Now, at this point, this is where negative feedback really kicks in, because as your conditions return closer to normal, you're going to have less and less of a need for this response. So let's say that the stimulus was that your blood glucose levels were too high. At that point, you're going to produce insulin to start to clear that blood glucose from your bloodstream. And as that glucose level approaches normal, you're going to produce less and less insulin, because you're getting closer and closer to normal levels. So here's an example of negative feedback. So we're going to refer to this more directly. So as the blood glucose level rises, the pancreas is going to secrete insulin. And what insulin does is, well, for one thing, it causes the liver to store glucose, but it also directs cells around the body to take glucose up from the bloodstream. So glucose gets removed from the bloodstream. And at that point, as glucose, the blood glucose level reduces, the stimulus for insulin production is reduced and eventually completely inhibited. So what should be happening is you'll have a rise or a spike in your blood glucose level from taking in some sort of sugar or carbohydrate. And this spike will come back down as you produce insulin. But as that spike comes back down closer and closer to normal blood glucose levels, you're not going to need as much insulin. And so you produce less insulin, and This is what's called negative feedback. So at the point where you reach normal blood glucose levels, the pancreas will stop secreting insulin. So hormones can also be regulated by the release of an antagonistic hormone, and again, insulin is a great example of this. It gets offset by the secretion of glucagon. And so what glucagon will actually do is to raise your blood glucose level. Insulin will lower your blood glucose level. So let's say that you have maybe produced a little bit too much insulin and you're starting to get a little bit low on blood glucose. At this point, when your blood glucose gets too low, you're going to produce glucagon. The pancreas is going to produce glucagon and raise that blood glucose level back up. So in this slide, we're going to talk about a couple of different actions of hormones, but also the different structures of hormones. So hormones are going to act on target cells, and they may cause the increase of an uptake of a particular substance, and they may bring out about an alteration of the structure of the target cell. So they can also cause cells to produce more substances, and they can also result in mitosis of a target cell. So hormones can have a lot of different effects. There are two main structural or chemical classes of hormones. There are peptide hormones, which include peptides, proteins, glycoproteins, modified amino acids. The most important thing that I want you to get out of this, and you see the modified amino acid on the left, is that all of these different types of hormones are built from amino acids. So they may be a single modified amino acid, or they can be a much more complex peptide or protein that's built from amino acids. The second chemical class is steroid hormones, and it's the same complex of four rings that's basically based on cholesterol. So take a look at cholesterol on the left, and then to the right of it, you can see that it's got the same basic four-ring structure. But the side chains that come off of it, the little CH3s that come off of it, these things are different. So if you look at testosterone, it's got a double bond O in place of the OH on the lower left. It's got the CH3 groups in the same place. But where you've got that string of carbons up at the upper right, it's got an OH group instead. Now, comparing testosterone to estradiol, which is the most active of female estrogens, you can see that there's not a very big chemical difference at all between testosterone and estradiol, yet they have dramatically different effects. So hormones do function as chemical signals. This is the way that cells communicate to one another and direct the actions of one another. So the reason why this is your means of communication is because it's not like cells can talk to each other or send each other visual signals. You've got to send chemical signals. So these will affect the metabolism of the target cells or the actions of the target cells that have the appropriate receptors. Now, this is something that I cannot emphasize too heavily, that a cell has to have the appropriate receptor to be able to respond to a hormone. So if a target cell or if a potential target cell doesn't have the appropriate receptors, you could dip that cell in a bucket of the hormone and it would do nothing. It has to have the appropriate receptor on its cell surface in order to be able to respond to a particular hormone. So when it comes to peptide hormones that we saw in the previous slide, the receptors are on the cell surface because those hormones cannot make their way through the cell membrane. For steroid hormones, the receptors are actually inside the cell, sometimes inside the cytoplasm, and sometimes inside the nucleus. And the reason why these receptors are inside the cell is because those steroid hormones have the ability to slip through both the cell membrane and, if needed, the nuclear membrane. So this is basically what I wanted to show you with respect to hormones. So here we've got a capillary, and here we've got some cells in the interstitial space that surrounds capillaries. Okay, we're going to populate the capillary with hormones, and what will happen is these hormones will actually leak out of the capillaries. And so you'll see them in interstitial space surrounding the cells here. Now, with these cells, you'll notice that these cells have receptors, and I want you to notice that the shapes on the receptors actually differ. And that makes a difference because if you look at the shape of the hormones, you can see that the hormones fit neatly into the receptors for some cells, and that makes them target cells. But they don't fit well at all into the receptors for non-target cells. And what this means is that hormones can affect specific cells or specific tissues. Okay, pheromones are chemical signals that act between individuals of the same species. And you can't really call these hormones because they're not released into the bloodstream, they're released externally. The effects of pheromones are better known in animals other than humans. So, for instance, female moths can release a pheromone that acts on male moths even miles away. Other examples include, I think a great example is Japanese beetles. So basically, when I was your all's age, Japanese beetles were a huge problem until somebody came up with the idea of traps for male Japanese beetles that involved releasing a pheromone from a trap. A bunch of male Japanese beetles would come in looking to mate and get caught in the trap. And so after this, the Japanese beetle population went way down in this area. They're a lot less common than they used to be. Another good example of pheromones is what bee and ant queens will do. They'll actually direct the workers in the hives or in the colonies with pheromones. So humans do produce pheromones, and these are airborne chemicals that get released by the scalp, by the oral cavity, by the axilla, in other words, the armpits, and in the genital areas. And their effect is much less dramatic than it is in a lot of other animals. This is the reason why it says that it possibly may play a role in mate attraction. So axillary secretions can also affect the menstrual cycle. So basically, if you have several women who are menstruating living in the same house, then their menstrual cycles will actually sync up and they'll happen more or less simultaneously. Now we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland as two major portions of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus will regulate your internal environment in a couple of different ways. One is through the autonomic nervous system. So this is that fight or flight system that we talked about in the last test. And this regulates things like heartbeat, blood pressure, appetite, and so forth. But it'll also regulate the internal environment through the control of pituitary gland secretions. So we'll talk about the different mechanisms of hormone release from the posterior pituitary and from the anterior pituitary. So in the posterior pituitary, you've got neurons in the hypothalamus that are called neurosecretory cells. These are going to produce either antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin. And so these hormones are produced in the cell body of the neurons. They travel down the axons and they get stored in axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is basically a mass of axon terminals that stores these hormones. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the mechanism of hormone release from the posterior pituitary. And so the cells that are involved here are called neurosecretory cells. These are neurons, specialized neurons. You'll see the cell bodies of those neurons up in that green portion embedded in the hypothalamus, and they send axons down that stalk called the infundibulum between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And so let's take a look at how this works. So the first thing that happens is that neurosecretory cells produce ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. And these hormones are represented by the green dots. So they'll produce them in the cell bodies, and as you can see, these hormones will actually travel down the axons to the axon endings. So when it's appropriate, when the situation calls for it, ADH and oxytocin are secreted from axon endings into the bloodstream. So let's take a look at the axon endings. Here you can see ADH and oxytocin, and they get produced into the bloodstream. So what's going to happen there is once they're in the bloodstream, they're going to be able to affect specific tissues, cells, and organs that have the receptors for these hormones. So you can see here that kidney tubules have receptors for antidiuretic hormone. What that's going to do is it's going to cause them to retain water. And we'll see more detail on this mechanism a little later on in this PowerPoint. What we'll also see later is how smooth muscle is affected in the uterus by oxytocin. So basically what it'll do is it will increase the force and the frequency of muscular contractions in the uterus during childbirth. What oxytocin will also do is it will also cause something called milk letdown. This is not the same as milk production, but what it'll do is it'll transport milk after it's been produced by the mammary glands to the surface of the skin. So that's what oxytocin is going to do. So you saw a couple of different posterior pituitary hormones mentioned. One is antidiuretic hormone. And this gets released from the posterior pituitary in response to an increased concentration of the bloodstream. So basically the blood is a little bit too thick. There's not enough water in it. And so what antidiuretic hormone is going to do is it's going to cause you to actually retain water by reabsorbing an increased amount of water in the kidneys. So as this water reabsorption occurs, the blood concentration becomes normal, and as the blood concentration comes back up to its normal level of water in the bloodstream, ADH will then get shut off, and this is another example of negative feedback. Oxytocin causes uterine contractions and milk letdown during lactation, and we talked about that briefly. So basically, when there's some sort of pressure or irritation on the uterus during childbirth, this causes oxytocin release. And oxytocin causes contraction, which causes more pressure and irritation, which causes the production of more oxytocin, which causes faster and harder contractions. So what you've got here is a positive feedback effect where instead of the production of the hormone causing its own shutdown, the production of the hormone is going to cause it to snowball and produce way more of that particular hormone and way more of a response until you get a resolution to whatever's going on. And in this case, you'll get faster and harder contractions until childbirth happens. So again, this is an example of positive feedback. Now we're going to talk about the anterior pituitary, which is a little bit more complex because the production mechanism is a little bit more complex, and it also produces more hormones than the posterior pituitary does. So this is basically a portal system, and we'll see a picture of this in a few slides. And a portal system is basically two capillary beds that are connected by a vein. And this particular portal system, there's a capillary network around the hypothalamus, there's a capillary network around the anterior pituitary, and there are a couple of veins that connect these two capillary beds. And like I said, we'll see a picture of this in just a minute. So basically, the hypothalamus will control the anterior pituitary in a very different way. So unlike the posterior pituitary where you get direct signals from the neurons, in this case, you're going to have hormones released into this portal system. And when those hormones get released, then they're going to do one of two things. So you see this as hypothalamic releasing hormones. And what this means is these hormones are going to direct the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. You've also got hypothalamic inhibiting hormones, which will tell the anterior pituitary to not release those same hormones. There are three anterior pituitary hormones that have target effects on other glands. So these hormones will tell other endocrine glands produce your product. So thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, will stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce its hormones called glucocorticoids. The gonadotropic hormones will stimulate the gonads to produce estrogen and testosterone. So control of the release of hormones is guided not only by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, but also the target gland itself. So let's take a look at what happens to release hormones from a target gland. First of all, the hypothalamus will release its own releasing hormone. And so if you look at that first blue arrow, that's pointing to the anterior pituitary. And what the anterior pituitary will do in response to hormone 1 is it will release its own stimulating hormone, which is hormone number 2. Now in this case, the example of a target gland is the thyroid gland, which you can tell from the shape here. And so the thyroid gland is going to release its own hormones, which we'll just call hormone number 3. So here hormones 1 and 2 and 3. Hormone 1 has stimulated the release of hormone number 2. Hormone number 2 has caused the release of hormone number 3. Now that means you're going to have elevated levels of hormone number 3 in the bloodstream. And if you look at the red arrows, this is basically negative feedback arrows. That's what it's supposed to indicate. And so what it indicates is that increased production of hormone number 3 will reduce the levels of hormone number 2 that are produced, and will also reduce the levels of hormone number 1 that are produced. And so as more hormone 3 gets produced, the production of hormones 1 and 2 falls off, and that way you keep the levels of hormone number 3 within a certain level in the bloodstream. So there are 3 anterior pituitary hormones that do not affect other endocrine glands. And let's take a look at these hormones. One is called prolactin, and this stimulates the mammary glands to synthesize milk. Now I realize I just said that these hormones don't affect other endocrine glands. The mammary glands are actually exocrine glands, which produce a product that's released to the surface of the body, not into the bloodstream. So in this case, prolactin is stimulating an exocrine gland to produce its product. Melanocyte stimulating hormone will stimulate melanocytes of the skin, and this is basically how you get a tan. So these specific cells in the skin that produce melanin are affected by melanocyte stimulating hormone. Finally, growth hormone will stimulate bone and muscle growth. It'll increase protein synthesis and fat metabolism. So growth hormone is not only involved in what you would think of as growth where you get taller, but it's also involved in repair. So now we're going to take a look at hormone release from the anterior pituitary. And so we're not looking at the green cells this time, we're looking at the yellow cells this time. And this is a completely different mechanism of hormone release. And so the first thing that's going to happen is that the neurosecretory cells are going to produce hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones. And so the hypothalamic releasing hormones are going to instruct the pituitary gland to release its hormones, or different cells in the pituitary gland to release their hormones. The hypothalamic inhibiting hormones are going to instruct the anterior pituitary not to release its hormones. So basically, these are hormones that are going to control the anterior pituitary, but either by telling it produce your hormones, or by telling it don't produce your hormones. So if we take a look at the axon terminals, which you could just see flashing, these hormones get secreted into a portal system. And so what you'll see is these hormones traveling down blood vessels from capillaries surrounding the axon terminals down to capillaries that are surrounding cells in the anterior pituitary. So here we go. Now the next thing that happens here is these hormones will diffuse out of the bloodstream and make contact with the anterior pituitary cells. And in this case, what I decided to diagram was the production of an anterior pituitary hormone, which you see in purple here. And what happens here is that these cells will then release their hormones into the bloodstream, which then delivers these to specific cells, tissues, and glands. So those, again, containing the receptors necessary to receive these signals. And for anterior pituitary hormones, this has the ability to affect a lot of different hormones, or a lot of different tissues and cells and organs. So thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid to produce its hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, will cause the adrenal cortex to produce its hormones. Prolactin will cause the mammary glands to produce milk. This, again, is different from oxytocin, which causes the release of milk once it's produced. It's prolactin that causes it to be produced in the first place. The anterior pituitary can also release FSH and LH, which are gonadotropic hormones, which will instruct the ovaries and testes to either produce sperm or mature ova, or they'll cause the ovary or the testes to release either estrogen and progesterone in the case of ovaries or testosterone in the case of testes. Growth hormone will cause basically the growth of bones and tissues and other cells around the body. And in the integument, melanocyte-stimulating hormone will cause the production of melanin by these melanocytes. And so we'll examine the specific action of each of these hormones a little later on in this PowerPoint. Now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. So the thyroid gland is a large gland that's located in the neck, and it's at the trachea just below the larynx. And if somebody's choking and has to have an emergency tracheotomy, then that actually risks damage to the thyroid gland, and it's something that you definitely shouldn't do unless it's to save somebody's life. The parathyroid glands are embedded in the back surface, the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. We've seen that already in this PowerPoint. So the thyroid gland has a lot of follicles, and each one of these is a structure of thyroid cells, and they produce triiodothyronine, which is otherwise known as T3, thyroxine, which is also known as tetraiodothyronine, or T4, and this actually has 4 iodine atoms. And so if you've ever wondered why table salt is iodized, it's because there used to be a lot more iodine deficiencies in the United States, and so it was included as something added to table salt. And so while I realize that sea salt and maybe the pink Himalayan salt, that these may taste a little bit better and not as bitter as iodized salt, it's not a good idea unless you eat a lot of seafood or other iodine containing foods to abandon iodized salt completely. So the thyroid requires iodine to produce T3 and T4, which is the reason why you need to definitely take that in your diet. So an iodine deficiency will cause something called simple goiter, which we'll see in a minute. T3 and T4, what they do is to increase the metabolic rate. So by doing so, they'll stimulate most body cells to metabolize glucose and utilize more energy. And so if somebody puts on a lot of weight pretty quickly, that can actually be a sign of hypothyroidism, or a low level of activity by the thyroid. So the thyroid gland also produces something called calcitonin, and calcitonin is a calcium regulating hormone that gets produced in response to increased blood calcium levels. Now, one of the things that we've already seen in this video is where the parathyroid gland produces a hormone that causes calcium to be taken off of bones in response to low blood calcium levels. Now, if your blood calcium levels are too high, this is when you will produce calcitonin. And what it will do is cause this uptake of calcium by the bone. So basically, osteoblasts, a type of bone cell, will pull calcium out of the bloodstream and sort of embed it into bone tissue. Calcium levels are very tightly regulated because calcium is important in muscle contraction and in nerve conduction and in blood clotting. The parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, and I just made mention of this. And what parathyroid hormone will do is to cause an increase in blood calcium and a decrease in blood phosphate. So again, what these do is to increase what's called osteoclast activity and the reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys. This will also stimulate the activation of vitamin D that's needed for calcium absorption in the digestive tract. So basically, you can take in a lot of calcium, but if you have low levels of activated vitamin D, you won't be able to take that calcium up, and the calcium will simply pass through your digestive tract without being absorbed. And this is basically one of the reasons why you get vitamin D as an addition to milk, so that you can actually make use of the calcium that's contained in milk. So when blood calcium levels increase, you see a shutoff of parathyroid hormone. So let's take a look at the regulation of blood calcium level by these two glands and these two hormones. So let's say that you have high blood calcium. Here's what's going to happen. So the thyroid gland will secrete calcitonin into the bloodstream. And what that's going to do is, again, to raise your levels of calcitonin. What calcitonin will do is to cause osteoblasts in the bones to take up calcium from the bloodstream. And when that happens, your blood calcium level lowers. And you'll bring your blood calcium back down to a normal level. And at that point, you're going to stop producing calcitonin. Now, on the flip side, if you've got low blood calcium, what's going to happen here is that the parathyroid glands, which are those small brown dots on the back of the thyroid, will release PTH or parathyroid hormone into the bloodstream. What that's going to do is, again, it'll increase your levels of parathyroid hormone. This, in turn, will activate vitamin D and cause you to absorb more calcium from the digestive tract. It'll also signal the calciums to reabsorb more calcium from kidney tubules, and it'll also signal osteoclasts to break down bone tissue and release calcium into the bloodstream. Now, the long-term effects of elevated levels of parathyroid hormone can lead to osteoporosis. Okay, so anyway, as your blood calcium levels come back up, you're going to stop producing parathyroid hormone. And so this is how you bring your blood calcium levels back up to normal from low. The previous slide showed you how you bring high blood calcium levels back down to normal. And again, these are levels that are very tightly regulated, because small differences in your blood calcium concentration can cause major malfunctions in the skeletal system, in the skeletal muscles and in the nerves. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at the adrenal glands, and this is something that I'm sure that you've associated with adrenaline, or epinephrine as it's otherwise known, fight or flight response. But as we're going to see, the adrenal glands actually do a whole lot more than just produce epinephrine. So first of all, they sit atop the kidneys, and there are two parts of the adrenal gland that do function actually independently of one another. One is the adrenal medulla, which is the outer portion, and this is the portion that is responsible for producing epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's under the control of the nervous system. The adrenal cortex is under the control of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary. So you've basically got two layers here that do different things. The adrenal medulla will produce adrenaline in response to a fight or flight situation. The adrenal cortex will produce adrenocorticotropic hormone when it's signaled to do so by the anterior pituitary. And these are basically responses to short-term stress and to long-term stress, and we'll examine this in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about the release of hormones from the adrenal medulla. So basically, the hypothalamus will send nerve impulses via the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla. So this is going to secrete two hormones, epinephrine, which is otherwise known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine. And this is basically a response to stress. This can be a fight or flight response, but this can also be produced under any circumstances where you need an increased heart rate and increased respiration rate, as in when you're just exercising. So this is not just an emergency response. This can also be a response to fairly normal everyday conditions. On the other hand, the adrenal cortex, this results in long-term changes. So you get the production of two different types of hormones. One is called glucocorticoids, and what they're going to do is to regulate carbohydrate and protein and fat metabolism but their most basic thing that they do is to lead to an increase in the blood glucose level. Mineralocorticoids are going to regulate salt and water balance, and this can change your blood volume and blood pressure. Let me go back to the glucocorticoids for just a moment. Glucocorticoids can also cut down on your inflammatory response, and we'll examine the implications of that in just a minute. So cortisol is your principal glucocorticoid, and this is something that you may have heard. You may have heard of cortisone or hydrocortisone. Cortisol is chemically similar to these. So its actions are to promote the breakdown of muscle proteins to amino acids, because the liver will use amino acids to make glucose. It'll also promote the metabolism of fatty acids, which spares glucose, and basically this will give you a rise in blood glucose. So this is going to be beneficial under stress. It'll also counteract the inflammatory response. Now this is beneficial up to a certain point, but because it counteracts the inflammatory response, and the inflammatory response is a major part of your immune system, it also means that cortisol can actually cut down on the ability of your immune system to function. So you may have heard of people who take steroids for allergies, which is a dysfunction of the immune system, or autoimmune diseases like lupus, where the immune system attacks your own body. And so steroids like cortisol can actually help lower the level of the immune system in those cases. But if you're not having an allergic response, and if you are not suffering from an autoimmune disease, then over the long term, cortisol can depress your immune system, and that's the reason why people who are under long-term stress are more likely to get sick than people who aren't. Okay, mineralocorticoids, their secretion is not actually controlled by the anterior pituitary. Aldosterone is the principal mineralocorticoid hormone, and it targets the kidney. What it will do is it'll increase the absorption of sodium. And if you increase the absorption of sodium, you'll also increase the reabsorption of water in the kidneys. So basically, aldosterone will help you retain water. Its secretion gets controlled by the release of renin from the kidney. So basically what's going to happen is the kidney is going to detect that the blood volume may be a little bit low. And what low blood volume does is to reduce blood pressure, and at a certain point this can be really dangerous. And so basically when the kidneys detect that there is a lowered blood pressure, then they'll act to release renin. Renin will eventually cause the release of aldosterone, and what aldosterone will do is cause the kidneys to retain water, and that will raise your blood pressure. So again, renin gets released when blood pressure is low and when blood sodium levels are low. And what it's going to do is it'll activate a protein that circulates in your bloodstream. This is called angiotensinogen. It'll activate it to angiotensin 1. It'll also act to convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 via an enzyme in the lung capillaries. This enzyme in the lung capillaries is called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. And if you've ever heard of somebody who is on an ACE inhibitor, an ACE inhibitor is a chemical that blocks the action of ACE. Okay, ACE will stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. So if I can return back to ACE for just a minute, there's something that I think that you'll find to be pretty interesting. The receptor for ACE in your respiratory system appears to be a major route by which the COVID-19 or the coronavirus actually enters respiratory cells. Now, ACE inhibitors actually block this receptor, which may act to block the action or block the ability of the coronavirus to enter respiratory tissue. So people who are on ACE inhibitors may have a little bit of added protection for their respiratory system from the coronavirus, but that at this point is not well known enough for me to be definitive about that at the time that I'm recording this video. So anyway, what angiotensin II will do is to constrict arterioles, and this will increase blood pressure. So you're doing a couple of different things here with all of this mineralocorticoid release. You're increasing the volume of the bloodstream, or the amount of water in the bloodstream, but at the same time, you're reducing the container size of the bloodstream. You're making the bloodstream actually smaller, which will also increase blood pressure. So reabsorbing sodium, constricting arterioles, these are two ways that are very effective in raising your blood pressure. So atrial natriuretic hormone is produced when the atria of the heart are stretched. So there's actually release of a hormone by the heart. And the reason why it's being mentioned here in this context with the adrenal cortex is that atrial natriuretic hormone opposes the action of aldosterone. It'll inhibit the release of aldosterone. This will result in natriuresis, which is the excretion of sodium in the urine. So if you pass more sodium in your urine, then water will follow it, and that means that you'll release more water, so blood volume and blood pressure will decrease. So aldosterone can be a response to low blood pressure. Atrial natriuretic hormone can be a response to high blood pressure. So let's take a look at long-term stress and short-term stress responses as directed by the hypothalamus. So if you've got some sort of stress over the long term, here's what's going to happen basically. So you'll have neurosecretory cells which produce a hypothalamic releasing hormone. And so what this particular hormone will do is instruct the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. And ACTH will be released into the bloodstream and make its way to the adrenal cortex. In response, the adrenal cortex will produce glucocorticoids, which will cause the protein and fat metabolism instead of glucose breakdown, and will also reduce inflammation. So basically, they'll suppress immune cells. The adrenal cortex will also produce mineralocorticoids, and what these mineralocorticoids will do is to cause sodium ions and water to be reabsorbed by the kidney, and therefore blood volume and blood pressure will increase. Now let's take a look at the short-term stress response. And in the short-term stress response, neurons in the hypothalamus will send nerve impulses down to the spinal cord, where they will synapse with sympathetic fibers, which will then connect to the adrenal medulla. And in response to these signals, the adrenal medulla will secrete both epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will cause the heart rate and blood pressure to increase, which will increase blood glucose levels, and muscles will become energized. So here you can see how the hypothalamus is eventually in charge of both short and long-term stress responses.